I was talking with a priest earlier this week, and he had mentioned to me that he normally likes to put a personal story into his homily. And I said, yeah, that's a good idea, and on the discussion went. When I got home, I looked at the gospel reading for this coming Sunday, which I just read, and realized it's a story about murder, adultery, divorce, and lying. I was thinking, I wonder how he's going to put that personal story into that gospel reading. Or perhaps it'll be his best homily yet. In this gospel, Jesus confronts sin. He confronts serious sin, big sins. In fact, the way he does it is even quite aggressive. I think perhaps all of us should be squirming a little bit hearing that gospel reading. If we're taking it seriously and personally, Jesus is being quite aggressive in the way he's confronting sin, especially serious sin, in that gospel reading. We also know if we have a relationship with Jesus Christ, we should not just squirm in our chairs when we hear him talking to us. We also know the fuller picture of who Jesus is, that he is a God and a person of great mercy. And so we are thankful for his great ocean of mercy and the great mercy that he extends to us. To really enjoy the mercy that Jesus offers, we have to first take sin seriously. If we want to take his mercy seriously and really let his mercy into our lives, again, we have to first acknowledge that there is such a thing as sin, and then also, again, take it seriously, and then God's great mercy, we can enjoy it even more, to know how merciful and loving that he is. But of course, if we take his mercy for granted, then it's not all that helpful. As again, Jesus confronting these sins of murder, adultery, and divorce, it seems to me that good people, church-going people, we probably don't need to debate any of those things. We probably already know in our good sense that those things are wrong. Of course, it's good for all of us to be reminded of those things, and of course, even to the seriousness of those sins. It's a good reminder. And as Jesus did, very bravely and courageously confronts people who are misleading others. And so perhaps we need to be reminded, and we also need to have the courage to challenge others who are committing these sins, and especially those who are misleading young people with these particular sins. Now, as I mentioned, these sins, or the sins Jesus mentions, murder, adultery, and divorce, and lying, we might say, well, is divorce always a sin in that list of sins? And you can say, well, it might not always be a sin. There may be a sad case where divorce is justified, but it's always a mess, divorce. It's always a car crash, so to speak. Sometimes we can't avoid a car crash, but it's always a sad situation that we try our best to avoid. As we do our best to avoid these big sins or these serious sins, or again, I think, the average person knows these things are wrong, but how do we avoid them? I think that to avoid the big sins, we have to also acknowledge that there are such things as small sins. It seems most often that it's the small things that point people in the wrong direction. Most good people just don't set out to commit a big bad sin. But sometimes good people commit little sins, and those little sins start to break us down and weaken us, and then that big sin comes along and the person falls into it. So even for us to be on guard with those little sins, and as Jesus mentions in that gospel, the smallest letter of the law, that we will be accountable for upholding even that. And I think that's what he's talking about, that we have to take the little things also seriously. Otherwise, again, the slippery slope begins and the snowball begins, and before we know it, we got a big problem. So again, even the little things have to be addressed seriously. As we reflect on our moral life that Jesus is teaching us here in this gospel, we believe that our prayer life, by our church attendance, it helps to give us strength to lead a good moral life. We believe the moral life and the spiritual life go hand in hand. Both of them rely upon each other. Some people might say, well, as long as I'm praying, it doesn't really matter what I do. We say, well, that's a pretty crazy way of thinking. Yes, it does. If we're honestly praying, then our lives should reflect our prayers. or conversely to say, as long as I'm a good person, I don't really need to be praying. We also know that's a joke, because people who aren't praying, eventually they'll break down and start committing sins. And so having a well-integrated prayer life and a well-integrated moral life, and knowing how those two things fit together, is very important. And so as we gather this morning to celebrate this Eucharist, we believe that this Eucharist will give us strength to be good people, to be good moral followers of Jesus and his commandments.